Welcome to Handmade Happenings. I'm Marissa and this is part 3 of my summer project, and I'm talking today about the embroidery. So in a lot of ways this is the highlight of the project because the actual dress is fairly simple, and that kind of was a theme throughout most of the inspiration that I found. It was fairly simple dresses and then with just really fancy trim around the edges. Now most of this inspiration seemed to use the really wide fancy ribbon. I believe it's called jacquard ribbon. However, there was a couple of problems with using that. The first was trying to find ribbon that I liked and that matched my fabric. The second was just cost, because the wider ribbons like that tend to cost more per yard, and with the amount that I needed, it just adds up. So instead, I decided to hand embroider the trim, and well, here we are. Now, I'm not that good at hand embroidery, so I knew that whatever design I picked could not be but so elaborate, or I wouldn't be able to do it. Unfortunately, most of the designs I found, while I really liked them, were just too difficult for me to do. So I did end up kind of designing my own pattern to go off of. Unfortunately, I don't have any footage of that, so I'm not going to bore you with just me talking. However, I will say that it was surprisingly more mathematical than I would have thought. The design I ended up settling on was daisies with stems and leaves winding between them, and then a chain stitch border on either side. Now for the neckline and the sleeves, this did get embroidered directly onto the fabric, and I believe it was probably mentioned very briefly in the last video. However, I am not going to go into it here just to avoid getting repetitious. So we're mostly going to be focusing on the skirt because that's where I spent the majority of my time when I was embroidering, and it is the easiest way to explain this design in more detail. I chose not to embroider directly onto the skirt for a couple of reasons. The first is that once this dress is no longer a costume, I do want to shorten it to turn it into more of an everyday dress. And the second is that I just didn't want to carry all of that fabric around while I was doing the embroidery. So instead, I cut a 4-inch wide strip of fabric, and it was slightly longer than the width of my skirt hem. Then I folded over each raw edge and pressed it so that I ended up with a 2-inch wide ribbon. I then took a heat erase pen and drew lines 1/4 inch from each edge, these to mark the border placement. Then right down the center of the ribbon, I made small dots 1 3/4 inches apart, the 1 3/4 inches being the distance between the center of each flower, so each dot represents the center of the flowers. Now for the actual embroidery. With this, I started with the flowers, and for my flower pattern, I actually took a flower, like a clip art flower, and resized it to the size I needed and printed it off to use to trace. So I placed my fabric into an embroidery hoop with the folded edges undone, and once it was in place, I then centered the dot on my fabric over top of the flower pattern. I then traced it with my pen, and I found that this gave me the neatest looking outline compared to trying to trace it before I put it on the hoop, because it held the fabric still so that I could trace it without it getting all funny shaped. Once it was traced, I then stitched the petals in white using a satin stitch, and the center of the flower was stitched also in a satin stitch, but in a bright yellow. Next was the border. I did this in the same green that I plan to use for the stem and the leaves, and it was just a simple chain stitch done along that line that was marked 1/4 inch from the edge. And to keep my chain stitches even, I took a 1/4 inch elastic and created a loop out of some of it. And I would just stick that on my finger and use that kind of as a guide to get somewhat even stitches. Lastly was the stems and leaves. So in between the flowers, I drew a slightly curved line and alternated just between curving that line up and curving it down. I then followed those lines using a stem stitch, and every few stitches I would just stop and add a leaf using the lazy daisy stitch. And with the embroidery finished, I just went and pressed it again to erase the pen ink, and then I pinned it to the hem of the skirt and stitched it on by hand using a fairly loose running stitch, just to make it easier to remove it later when I go to shorten this dress. Thank you for watching. I hope you will come back next week for part 4 of this series, which will include the final reveal.